when the sky is high. No reason to stay around. Pick your hands and you can touch and fly.
Welcome to the Aviatrix book review. I'm Liz Booker. My guest today is the author of 15 books, including 10 works of narrative nonfiction. She is director of Transatlantic Storytelling, an ongoing series of online workshops for writers here and abroad, and an affiliate professor of storytelling and social change at the University of Washington. You can find her at her website, laurenkessler.com, and on her blog, Lauren Chronicles. We're talking today about her book, The Happy Bottom Riding Club, The Life and Times of Pancho Barnes. Dr. Lauren Kessler, welcome. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be here.
For those who haven't read your book, The Happy Bottom Riding Club, I thought we would start with a passage from the book. Do you mind reading?
I never mind reading. Thank you for asking. This is maybe about a quarter of the way through the book. And I thought that those of you who are pilots, and I bet that's a lot of you, maybe all of you would appreciate this one. Of the 4,690 licensed pilots in America in the summer of 1929, 34 were women. When a woman showed up at an airfield, test piloted a plane, or flew in a race, she, along with the airfield, the plane, and the race, assured publicity. Female flyers were so much of a novelty that they were almost a sideshow. They were also the most dramatic, most visible symbol of women breaking their Victorian pasts, defying convention as they defied gravity. It was a new age when young women of a certain class used their privilege not to shield themselves from experience, but to lunge at it. And no one lunged harder than Pancho. And of course, the women that she flew with. That was why when plans were announced for the first national air races to be held in Cleveland that summer, this is 1929, they were quickly followed by plans for an all-female cross-country air derby, the first in the world. It would be an endurance marathon as much as a race, with women flying sun up to sundown every day as they covered 2,800 miles from Santa Monica, California to Cleveland, Ohio. Each night they would stop at a different sponsoring city. After more than a week of flying with much hoopla, the racers would land in front of the main grandstand at the Cleveland Municipal Airport in the midst of a 10-day national event. It was not an easy course. For 8 days, 10 to 12 hours a day, the women would fly by dead reckoning, hopscotching across the Southwest and Midwest, guided only by compasses, sectional charts, and Rand McNally road maps, which they put on their laps while they were flying. Each would carry a gallon of drinking water, a 3-day supply of malted milk tablets, and beef jerky in case of a crash in desolate terrain. The pilots would stop en route only for fuel, rest, and food. They had 17 scheduled checkpoints. On the dirt field that August afternoon, the airplanes were strung out in 2 long lines as the crowd, estimated between 100,000 and 250,000, waited in the dust and searing heat for the radio-relayed pistol shot from Cleveland to cue the starter in the field. So 100,000 to 250,000 people watching the women's first air derby. Movie and stage comedian Will Rogers, an aviation enthusiast, presided over the ceremonies, entertaining the crowd, but not the leather-jacketed flyers, by referring to the women as flying flappers, petticoat pilots, sweethearts of the air, and winged beauties. He dubbed the air race the Powder Puff Derby. In the press tent, a reporter turned to his colleagues. "I don't care what you guys write about their bravery, their skill, their sportsmanship, or their adaptability to goddamn airplanes," he said. "What I'm gonna write is, them women don't look good in pants." Pancho was, so at precisely 2 p.m., the pistol shot in Cleveland sounded over the loudspeaker in Santa Monica, California, and at 1-minute intervals, the contestants took off to the wave of a starter's flag. Pancho was, of course, there. Pancho was confident as she flew over the familiar Southern California turf that first day. She'd spent several weeks in June flying the entire course all the way to Cleveland. So she knew well what lay ahead of her, and she was prepared for it. She had not done as much cross-country flying as some of the other women, but what she had done, she loved. She loved the challenge to wits and stamina, the feeling that she was alone up there and in charge. So that's it.
Oh, wow, Lauren. So yeah, you have captured like the history of women in aviation right there. Do you know that the Powder Puff Derby continues today as the Air Race Classic? And a lot of our audience participates in that, and it's on my bucket list of things to do. So it's really special that you read that part. And the part about women being a sideshow, I've posted a bunch of quotes from the book over the past few days leading up to our interview. I almost quoted that because I would offer that the majority of us all still feel like we're mildly a sideshow in many ways. The percentage of women in aviation is only still 7%, and we receive all kinds of reactions from awe to disdain. And so it's amazing to me that in over 100 years of flying, we feel like we're still in the same place where we started. That was a great reading, and this book is fabulous, and it's so special to this community. But this book falls within the context of a much larger body of work for you. And I was so intimidated, actually, when I started reading about all the other books that you'd written. And I actually, like, all of them sound fascinating to me. Tell me about your other works and sort of your immersive journalism.
Thanks for asking. The Happy Bottom Writing Club was actually was written a while ago, and it was the first of 2 biographies that I wrote. I had not, I'm a nonfiction writer. I am too interested in real people, especially women, but real people, real places, real events, to want to spend time making up things, I guess. I mean, I'd much rather be out there learning about the world than sitting in my room thinking about fictional characters. So I've never been, I do read fiction because I think there's a great thing for writers to learn from fiction about storytelling and character development and plot and all that stuff, but I'm not interested in writing that way. So I've written 2 biographies, and both about ill-behaved women and the price that one pays to be an ill-behaved woman, you know. But after that, I felt like I very much wanted to be more in the world than a biography allows you to be, especially if the person you're writing about is already dead and gone. With the book about Pancho, there were enough people alive at the time so that I went into, to her stomping grounds and checked out everybody and, saw where she was and that kind of stuff. But the last 5 books that I have written have been works of immersion, where I am I'm fascinated with subcultures. And in the sense, aviation is a subculture, right? So it's a group of people who are passionate about something that they do, and they speak in a language that they understand that other people don't understand. And they have rituals and they surround themselves. I love this. I'm fascinated by it. And I'm as fascinated with that as I am with, for example, the world of ballet, which I wrote about 2 books ago. I'm also fascinated with the world that takes place inside prisons, which I wrote about in my last book. So if you look at the scope of my work, it looks like, what is she doing? How can she write about a spy and a flyer and Japanese Americans and ballet and middle school and prisons? And the fact is, I'm interested in everything, but I'm mostly interested in hidden worlds, worlds that we actually walk through. We know they're there, but we know very, very little about the people who inhabit them. So that's what unites my work.
And you have a book about anti-aging, like Alzheimer's, all of these worlds. I just am fascinated by your curiosity, to be honest, like the fact that you are willing to put yourself in all of these diverse worlds and reveal them to us. Thank you.
Well, a lot, it's kind of like I get to live more than my own life, in a way. I mean, I hope I'm doing some good communicating this, I mean, to other people, to readers, but a lot of it's selfish in the sense that I only get to live once, I believe, unless I come back as an insect or something and make my way back up the chain. And so I kind of want to I want to suck all the juice out of that one life experience. And since the way to do that to me is to place myself in these different worlds and mostly be quiet and listen and try and understand the experience of others, and then take the time to research around it. So it's not just that thing, but everything around it, the whole world of aviation, for example, that whole moment in the 20s and 30s when women were coming of age in the sky. So the idea really is you get to live, when you read that book, you get to live somebody else's life. And in researching it, I got also to live another life.
So, what brought you to Pancho? How were you introduced to her? And why did you choose to spend the kind of energy and time that you did to write this book?
So how I was introduced to Pancho was my father-in-law was stationed at Edwards Air Force Base. And this was during, I think it was a Thanksgiving get-together. And my husband is one of 4 children. He has 3 older sisters, and the older sisters and I were sitting in the kitchen talking, and we heard these peals of laughter from another room, and ran into the other room, and it was my father-in-law telling a story about Pancho Barnes, who I had never heard of, and he had never really talked about being at Edwards or anything like that. He was at Edwards in the 50s, early 1950s. And so he told this story that was both what got me interested in Pancho and what was possibly the most challenging thing about researching and writing Pancho. He told me this story that was just, an unbelievable story about an unbelievable woman who couldn't possibly have done these things or said these things. And of course I was fascinated. I mean, who would not be fascinated? I knew nothing about aviation history. I'm not an aviation buff. And so this is all news to me. My beginning and end of women in aviation is Amelia Earhart, as is most people's, right? And so I started just looking her up, and not very much was written about her, but it put me on that path. So it was basically my father-in-law telling a story about those days of Pancho operating a fly-in and a house of ill repute that was entertaining and servicing the men who were stationed at Edwards Air Force Base, which my father-in-law was very careful to say did not include him, the servicing part. So that, I think, was the laughter there.
So I'm going to jump ahead to a question that I had for later, because so you've also, among your many books, written a book about writing. And so I read I read Pancho, and then I read your book about writing. And I'll be honest, when I hit the part where you were describing books you had written before, you described one as, and I wrote a book about a whorehouse in the Mojave Desert. And I was like, wait a minute, hold on. That's, I'm not sure you presented the information in a factual way, very journalistically, to allow me to come to my own conclusions. And so clearly your father-in-law saw this as a whorehouse. What conclusions did you come to in your research?
Well, it was in fact, she had very pretty women working there that she hand selected from Los Angeles, who served drinks, and evidence pretty much points to the fact that they made other income, making the lives of some of the men at Edwards Air Force Base a little happier. I would not say that that was her, it was a revenue stream. Let's just say that. She had a restaurant, she had overnight accommodations, she ran a rodeo, she had a fly-in. There were lots of things going on there. She grew alfalfa, she had animals, but it is fairly clear from court cases and other evidence that a number of the women who were working there were turning tricks. So.
Well, you just touched on several of the threads of Pancho's life. This woman is not a simple character. She's a very complex character. She had many, many threads in her life story, and you seem to have tracked many, if not all of them, down. Tell me, and so right now is a good time for a spoiler alert, because we might get into some things that, you know, if you read the book, Pancho's life is very interesting. She's a fabulous character. But, you know, if you're going to read the book, it's kind of fun to have the opportunity to see events unfold on the page. So we might be talking about things that happen in her life that, you know, might be more fun to approach with a fresh perspective. So if you haven't read the book, come back to this later, and we'll get into the book club part of this right now. So I want to know, like, there were so many threads to her life and her story. I want to know, like, how you teased them all out, and then how you made decisions about what goes into the book and what doesn't.
Wow. I mean, I appreciate the question. It's a craft question, and it is almost impossible to articulate the answer to it. I will say that you have to know way more than you need to know what you need to know. And this was actually the lesson that I learned as a reporter. So I went to school to be a newspaper reporter. And what turned me away from being a newspaper reporter very early on, like within the first year that I actually was out there, was this horrible feeling of writing to the end of what I knew. So I was on deadline, I was writing for a newspaper, and I'd go out and do a story, and it would be required that I write about it, and I would write about it. And I realized at one point, it was in the San Francisco area, and the San Francisco International Airport was part of my beat. And there was a story that I was writing about a new runway, and the amount of noise that would be generated by that. And I had to learn about decibels and all that sort of stuff. But I learned exactly what I needed to know to write this short piece. And when I finished writing it, I thought, you know, if my editor said, could you give me, in newspaper, they say inches, not so much online, but in actual newspapers that you hold in your hand, give me 5 more inches. So it's inches of type like that in a column. If my editor had said, give me 5 more inches, give me 3 more inches, I couldn't have done it. I knew nothing more. I knew nothing more. So the trick, if it's not a trick, to choosing the right material is having a lot of material to choose from and more than you need. The challenge of that is it makes it more difficult. The more material you have, the more material to choose from, right? And
Pancho gave you a lot of material.
yeah,
Oh my
yeah.
word.
But you just have to keep, I think that if you keep the theme in mind for any writers out there, it's not just like a biography is not just an annotated resume of somebody's life. She did this, then she did this. Hey, she did this, now she did this. That is, I mean, that's what you have to know as the researcher, but that's not constructing a life. That's not the life that she led. So you think, what's this woman about? You know, what is this woman at her core? And what did she do or say or that happened to her or that she made happen that feeds into the kind of woman she made herself into? Because she did. She was born into a life that she did not live. She was born into a upper middle class or upper class debutante Pasadena kind of life in a Victorian age. And she actively chose not to do that. Why? And where did that lead her? And what penalties did she pay for making those choices? So as long as I came up with that as my theme, it created a way of looking at the material and choosing from it.
And she paid for her choices. And it's heartbreaking because you see this big, brazen, larger than life character in her early and midlife, and you want I wanted a different ending for her. I wanted her to live that big, brazen life to the very end. And her little house of cards that she built crumbled on her. What impressions or what lessons did you leave personally with after doing all of this research, after writing this book? What's your opinion of Pancho?
I would not want her as my mother.
No, probably not.
My opinion of Pancho, I think that her resilience to me, her always having a plan B or C or D, you know, her never, you know, her always coming back after some setback, even though her comebacks were sometimes completely ill-advised and off the wall. And even though she made some pretty bad choices with those, her her perseverance in life, her joy in life, and her resilience, I think made me respect her in a very deep way, but not, you know, I think she'd be a very hard person to spend a lot of time with. I think yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. Like, she's fun to party with, but in terms of her emotional depth or like trying to make an emotional connection with her,
Yeah.
at least from what you were able to glean from your research, feels like it would have been difficult.
I think so. I think she just wasn't built that way. Yeah. And that's, I think she was an extreme extrovert, and she did so many public things that maybe it just, it's a personality type also. It's not necessarily just a choice, but I don't believe that she had a fully developed inner life. Let's just say she had a very developed outer life. So
I want to just go deeper about some of the research that you did. Well, first of all, talk about you had to get into this woman's finances because her mismanagement of her finances are a huge part of her story. I mean, she was born into wealth, she lost it, She earned it. She lost it again. She's pulling change out of her purse to pay for things. And at the end of her life, I mean, that is her unfortunate demise. Like, how did you research all of that? How did you pick what details to put in? Because there were times when I was reading and I was like, my husband's an accountant, and I'm like, oh my God, we're doing accounting again. I'm trying to keep track. But it's important to the story. Like, how did you figure all that stuff out?
Well, I will say that if after you read this book, you say to yourself, I hope no one ever discovers all that stuff about me, I will say, stay out of court. Because so much, she was a litigious person. And because of the things that she did, people sued her all the time as well. So, and that's public documents. Um, so a lot of this stuff is, if you make it into the court system, it's not just what transpires in court or what might be the decision. It's all of the documents that might be held someplace that you can get a hold of if you know where to go. So a lot of the financial information came from people suing her or her suing other people. And she had to disclose this stuff in order for the case to go forward. She also had a habit of being her own court attorney. Very bad idea. And so, so this is another thing. Don't go to court. And if you have to go to court, don't be your own attorney. So see, had Pancho asked my advice, I would have told her that. But that's where a lot of that stuff came from. And you're right. It was not just the fortune that she inherited, right, that she spent, but it was 2 other fortunes that she made herself that she spent. And people talk about losing a fortune, and it's often, oh, the Great Depression or something like took it away or something sad, right? She didn't really lose a fortune. She spent it. She loved big, fast airplanes and big cars and big parties. And she just spent that money. She spent it. She had a really good time spending all of her money, going broke, and then having another idea and making some more money and spending it all. And she had then, I think, and you hinted at this when you said the end of her life, I think she was surrounded by people who she thought of as friends, who were friends because she spent so much money. So I think she felt she was loved more than she was. It's not that, and some of those people just purely took advantage of her, but some of them just loved to be around a party girl who was spending money and had good liquor and, had great airplanes. But when push came to shove, or when she lost that money, or when she was down and out, then they were no longer interested.
So many times in the book, you talk about how Pancho and the characters around her as well, but Pancho herself liked to embellish a lot about her stories. And it's so funny because she's already an outrageous character. Like you talked about your father-in-law talking about her. All of that's unbelievable. And she herself embellished. How did you figure out what was true and what wasn't when you were writing the book?
Yeah, so I actually hinted at that with an earlier response when I said that it was what brought me into the story was this overblown funny story that my father-in-law told, and that also created a lot of concerns when I was when I was researching the story. And I'm not sure, I don't want to claim at all that I cut through all of that and managed to get at the absolute truth of anything, because I don't know that that's possible. Of course I tried. But one of the things, I guess, is staying around people long enough, because some of the stories that I would hear, especially from the desert rats down there when I went around into the Mojave looking for people that knew her, The first story they would tell me would be some fantastic story that I actually heard 4 or 5 times before. And then I'd say, well, were you there? And well, not really, but I heard it from somebody else, and that would be a clue. But if you keep coming back, and you show interest in the relationship that that person had with Pancho, and not just what cool story can you tell about some larger than life woman. That's the first story you get. And I certainly write that down, but I don't really, just like I didn't really believe my father-in-law's story. It's sort of a jumping off point. So one way is you find out if somebody who's telling the story was actually there. And you also hear the same story, some big story, a number of times. And then so it has sort of become legend. And you're right, she made herself into a legend in her own times, right? She made herself into a legend. So you just try and get the historical record. Where was she and what airplanes did she own and who was flying into her place in the Mojave, and how did she make her money, and all that kind of stuff. And you stay with people long enough so that they relax, so that their ego takes a little bit of a back seat, because their ego is tied to, I knew her, hey, and I'm going to tell this fantastic story, to, yeah, we did some hard drinking together and like that. So I did a lot of that, hanging out.
That sounds fun. Because if these people were hanging out with Pancho, they were probably pretty fun.
They were an interesting, it was mostly grizzled old men with scary yapping dogs.
Men after Pancho's heart.
That's the truth.
So I want to know, how this book has affected your professional, your personal, your writing life. How has publishing this book affected you?
Well, as I said, this was fairly early in my writing life. So I'd say a couple of things. One is it taught me that it began to teach me that lesson that I said to you, which is how much you have to know in order to know how much you need to know. It also taught me that you better stop researching sometime or another, or you will never get to the book. So there was that. I learned a lot of lessons, and I learned that lesson that I said to you before, which is you get at the core of something. This is somebody's life, but in my prison book, in my ballet book, you get at the core, the essence of your intent and what you want the reader to get, and you stay true to that. And I think that writing a biography really teaches you that, because so many biographies are just, she was born and then she did this and she did this and back and forth. And if you're fascinated with the character already, great. But if you're not, it doesn't get you fascinated, and it doesn't really help you understand the life. So I learned that. So every book I learned something, and I learned a lot. I also was a guest on Dave Letterman's show twice because of this book. Now, I'm not sure that helped me professionally. It was really odd. I would say twice, because the first time I flew all the way out there, first class, the only first time I'd ever flown first class, and stayed in a hotel that cost more each night than the mortgage on my house. Because they don't have, at the Letterman show, they didn't have a way of treating a nobody like me in a special way. So I was treated as if I were, like a Hollywood guest or something. And then they had to bump me because of the first time. Flew out, all this kind of stuff, met with a limousine with a guy holding my name up and all that kind of stuff. And then I'm in the green room and I had my hair done next to Willie Nelson. which is funny because he has no hair and I have all of this hair. So they
Wait,
spent a lot more
Willie
time
Nelson
there.
has no hair? Hold on.
Well, I mean, he has like 3 strands of hair that are stuck in a ponytail. Yeah. So all of this stuff. And then one of the guests, it was some beautiful Hollywood female actor, entranced Mr. Letterman, and her time went over. So every guest gets 7 minutes and she went 9 minutes. So they were going to have to cut my time, and they decided, no, just come back later. So I came back later with another expensive flight across the country, etc. So this is a great story to tell, sort of, but did it have an effect on my career? So after the Letterman show, the Happy Bottom Riding Club, the book, went on Amazon from number who knows what, Godzillion, with a bullet up to like 8 in the bestseller, and then 7 and 6. And the people at Random House were calling me every 5 minutes. And then within, I don't know, 2 days, it was back to where it was. So
You had a moment of glory. Pancho had a moment of glory. And I'm going to tell you that's really special for all of us women in aviation. So thank you. I'm so glad that happened.
But I have to say that at that time I thought, this is so good. I'll never have to worry about where my next book is going to be published. Publishers are just going to be like calling me and saying, please write this book. I'll give you a lot of money. Never. It never happened that way. It was a cool experience. I'm so thrilled that it happened to me. I'm so thrilled it happened to the book. The book had a moment, and it's still every bit as hard selling a book idea to a great publisher with a great editor as it ever was. So in terms of the commercial part of my writing career, it made no difference at all. In terms of my learning as a writer, every book takes me someplace and makes me better. Which is why when an interviewer asks me, what's your favorite book? It's always the book that I just finished, because it's my best work, the one I just finished.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, maybe we can give Pancho another moment and you another moment with this book. Because the great thing about a book like this one is that it's an historical figure. She is just a rich part of aviation history in general, not just women in aviation. Like the story that you wrote reveals the early days of aviation in general, and this gorgeous, colorful character. Anybody in the Air Force should read this book, by the way. You should all know this history, especially if you've ever been stationed at Edwards Air Force Base. So like this book can live well beyond the moment that Letterman gave it, because new people are coming into aviation all the time. New people are coming to the Air Force all the time, and they should know their history. So I just want to say thank you so much for preserving this history for us. It's a treasure for this community. And I want to read all your other work, but especially thank you for this.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. I will also say that it was this rich moment where Hollywood and aviation overlapped. And so I think that's fascinating too. So it's not just aviation. It's not just that moment in time. It's not just Southern California, but it's that aviation in Hollywood. And that is a very interesting mix of glamour and excitement and bravery and innovation. And just, it must have been a wonderful time to be alive.
Absolutely, especially if you had money.
Well, only if you had money. Yes.
Right, exactly. And what are you working on now?
So I wrote this book called A Grip of Time, which is about the the life you live when your entire life is lived in prison. And basically it was taught to me by the men that I have in the writers group. And after I finished writing that book, I generally jumped to a whole other subculture, a whole other subject, and I just couldn't leave this alone. And the reason I couldn't leave it alone is now I knew what incarcerated life was like. I mean, as much as a person could know I've never been incarcerated myself, but I spent a lot of time in prisons. So I knew what it was like. And then I read this statistic, and here's the statistic. Well, it's two of them. So 2.3 million people are incarcerated in the United States right now, men and women. 2.3 million, the most of anywhere in the world. 95% of those people get out at some point. And we think we are a country of second chances. We think that anybody can make it. What happens to those 600,000 people every year that come out? And I know what life they lived inside, and I know how ill prepared that life makes one. The kind of, the way that you can't make decisions for yourself, the way that you are punished for making decisions for yourself. Forgetting about guilt here and that we should incarcerate people who do bad things. That's not the point. The point is now they're out. And we want them to stay out. We don't want them to hurt us. We don't want them, but they have learned very little. And so I am, it's 2 years, 6 lives, and what happens. So I've been following 2 women and 4 men as they have left long-term incarceration, sometimes for really bad things like murder. And how they make it or don't make it in the world. And that's the book I'm working on right now.
Wow, Lauren, it's some deep stuff that you've been working on. All of your writing for social change, we emailed back and forth this week, and I was kind of sharing this project with you, and I knew about your work, but I mean, you don't know much about me or what I'm doing. And then when you wrote back and you said, oh, I would love to teach writing, especially writing for social change, which is what you're doing. And I was like, oh, yay, she gets me. Because I totally identify with what you're doing. I admire it. I respect you as a writer, and I'm so grateful for your time. And I want to spend more time with you. I want you to spend time with our writers, so we'll definitely work on that. Thank you so much for this interview.
Let's do that.
And thank you for your book. Thank you for this treasure for us. Thanks so much for listening. And before I go, I wanted to make sure that I mention Barbara H. Schultz and her book, Pancho, the biography of Florence Lowe Barnes, which I read over 10 years ago, and I fell in love with the book and Pancho, and that is what inspired me to want to read the Happy Bottom Writing Club for the book club this month. And please join us in the Aviatrix book club next month when we'll be reading Murder in Plain Sight by former aircraft mechanic Julie Holmes. Blue skies, everyone.
And he